Thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoy this curious story that falls into that indistinct territory somewhere between the curious and the frightening. Also, we all have to start somewhere, and the support of appreciative souls like you will always take us further as we learn our skills from sentence to sentence. I would really value having your support, by you subscribing and then hitting the notification bell, so you can know when the next part is published. And let me know where you are. Write it in the comments below. Anyway, I thank you for your attention. And if you wish to learn where the two main characters come from and what the story is all about, then why not go back to the very beginning? You're back? Right. Let's get on with it. Chapter 11. A Bridge Between Elsewheres. If multiverses actually exist, then you should be able to plot everyone's multiple destinies along a multi-dimensional line, which would probably make you throw up your breakfast if you tried to imagine it, I suppose. I was pondering on what I'd heard from the traveler. He'd said that the Earth was known across the universe as a shithole, and the island was only a stepping stone to somewhere else. And, apparently, something big was going on. Of course Shadow didn't talk. I mean, why should a cat talk to a stupid human? Regardless of my concerns over his well-being, Shadow kept disappearing and reappearing. He'd hang around for a while, disappear for 3 or 4 days at a time, sometimes longer, and then return as if nothing had happened. Of course, I knew the truth to be to the contrary, and guessed that something unfortunate or terminal had probably happened to someone somewhere. And I now knew that he had a reputation beyond our distressed little homestead as a callous little bastard. Also, I'd learned that this island home of mine had a reputation at a level I'd never imagined to be the case. Further, and not necessarily because of him as I'd initially suspected, Shadow's presence here was probably a reaction to the reported difficulties, and not a cause. I continued with my usual one-way conversations, expressing my concerns about anything untoward that had happened, either in general or specific terms. Perhaps notes were being taken somewhere, and passed on for consideration at a higher level. Probably for a good laugh, or to be ignored with the contempt reserved for all things human. Then as now, I controlled what I could control. Namely, my garden. I could have told you that the land around the house was changing its character rather than improving. Only someone who'd never been there would think the place looked nice. Nice was inadequate because it involved too many tangibles and intangibles, old history, recent history, emotional references individual to the viewer and good manners. I was chatting with the county council's young tree preservation officer, who shared my views on sycamores, although we had to point a fair distance to see one. She expressed concern that diseases and infections were destroying so many indigenous species. The TPO was a holistic tree person. She believed that even weed trees had their place as a vital singular ecosystem within a collective of ecosystems. It was a solid amen from me on the last point. Like many things in our lives, now they were gone, I was developing a fondness for sycamores as distinct living entities. She was either being circumspect or just hadn't noticed, but she'd said nothing about the massive pile of logs within yards of us. Instead, there seemed to be a collective haze surrounding their destruction under the most suspicious and puzzling circumstances. As I mentioned, neither NASA nor CERN ever turned up, which was astonishing, especially the second organization that had so much to do with exotic and weird. What happened here had to be viewed as extremely weird and definitely exotic. Yet, they hadn't bothered to turn up for a look. There was no sign of Shadow, and his favorite spots on the sofa and garden table left a void, not only of security but his presence. I'd managed to live busily and without a sense of loneliness before he'd turned up. The table looked empty of purpose, not supporting a cat, so I put a pot of French marigolds and some blousy petunias on it. I was trying to change my mind about the table because I'd developed this psychological discomfort whenever I looked at it. I was doing my best to change the emotional reference to prettiness, rather than nervous anticipation of the end of the world. The nice TPO gave me a list of trees I could plant here, and she also encouraged me to plant willows because they grew so quickly. I'd already spoken to someone I knew who had planted an arboretum in the north of the island about the most practical trees for shelter and propagation. He knew of my circumstances, now and previously, and had bought me 50 willow saplings for free. Thankfully there were still plenty of lovely people in the world. The TPO was enthusiastic and earnest. It was apparent to me that she hadn't come into too close contact with elected low-lives yet. In a couple of years, she told me, the willows would have grown enough to disrupt the direct power of the vicious easterly wind that swept across the island in winter. I was also advised to use the saplings for craft materials or fuel for burning. All this, and she winked at me in a most disarming and engaging manner that made me hate being old, I could do as long as I didn't tell the Welsh government. After all, they'd banned the practice of open fires. She was pleasant, and she was pretty. That worried me, because some evil elected bastard would be sniffing around, intending to take advantage of her innocence and earnestness. I was so concerned that I plain out and told her in the end. I was so relieved and encouraged when she told me she was leaving to go to university to become a geography and environmental studies teacher. Her last words made me feel a lot better about this world. "No need to worry," she said with a distinct twinkle in her eye, "I've got those bastards sussed." I accompanied her to the top of the track where she'd parked her car. I suggested that even in these days of emancipation and equality, it probably wasn't a good idea to turn up like this alone. She told me she'd spoken to her uncle, who had given me a good report as a dull person. Her uncle was Edward at the top of the road with the bra-less wife who kept waving things at me. Before her, I'd never regarded bosoms as such articulate communication devices. Considering her advice, I'd definitely better not tell the Welsh Assembly government that I had enough wood to burn to pollute the planet and bugger up their aspirations. For me, it was a rational and justifiable act. My finances showed gossamer thin if you were stupid enough to hold them up to the light. Wood, and maybe if I chose not to be too profligate, the odd bag of coal were all I could afford to heat the cottage. Also, even though I qualified, I'd never claimed any benefits. It's a circular and pointless argument in the end. Because I wasn't in receipt of benefits, I didn't qualify for a grant for a new heating system, but if I did qualify, I wouldn't have been able to afford to switch it on. Thankfully, some bloody aliens had knocked over the trees and resolved the matter of winter heating for the foreseeable future. There was so much wood that most of it would rot before I could use it. Again, my mind was wandering beyond autumn and into winter. The universe was contriving to persuade all the ducks into a tidy row to ensure my comfort. All this intent against my will. Lovely ducks and a confusing universe. I'd better keep that thought stored deeply in case I upset Shadow and make him feel I was undervaluing his great endeavors as part of a greater plan. After the more recent events and conversations with odd people, I'd naturally assumed that he did have a plan of sorts. Either that, or he was part of somebody else's plan. Anyway, lovely and smart TPO aside, I'd had about 30 sycamores reduced to logs by Cledwyn that, like it or not, would see me into my precocious old age. Cledwyn should now be renamed Cledwyn the Bastard, because no matter how high the pile, it just didn't look like 15 trees worth. I sought to resolve this matter by picking up his axe and threatening his head with it. It was only intended as a cursory threat, however. It had him reaching into his pocket and pulling out 60 quid that he threw at me in exchange for his life. The threat was meaningless, and yet another small duck had joined the tidy row and awarded me 60 quid. After he left with his last load, I looked at the mountain of logs, and felt guilty that I'd threatened him. Still, on the positive side, when you're poor, 60 quid is 60 quid. Moreover, I reckon that I should contact the Guinness Book of Records for the world's biggest bug hotel. Naturally, the evil bastard farmer next door had tried to steal another tree before Cledwyn finished. I actually physically grabbed him and threatened to tell his wife about his girlfriend. He capitulated immediately, begging me not to. Interesting that. I didn't even know he had a girlfriend. I was only threatening to create instability in his life because his wife scared me, and I think she scared him too. It was still surprising considering that the back end of a rusting muck spreader looked more attractive and cleaner than him. What was going on? I seemed to be moving past winter and my definite exit strategy with little concern, and for the first time in my life I was telling people what I thought of them. I was appalled at myself. But, on the other hand, I was also proud. I'd established and marked my territory without pissing on anyone's shoes, axe threats on the one hand and threatening to shop the farmer to his wife because of a girlfriend I knew nothing about. Ducks in a row, I tell you. I was puzzled. How the hell had the farmer managed to get a girlfriend? I wasn't questioning his challenging pulchritude. I was questioning how the hell do you do that? How do you go out and find a girlfriend? The solution lay in that last sentence, I realized. Go out. Amazingly, chatting up people is all practice. First, catch yourself a woman's attention. There we go, I thought. I failed before I even began. Who the hell would want to come here? The kind of woman who would come here would probably be from social services. In response, I could hear Jenny shout that all I needed was someone who was breathing and friendly. Yet for all my endeavors my home still felt like a poor place, and I'd be much too embarrassed to invite anyone here. Poverty in all its forms does that. The logs weren't the only positive thing to come out of losing all the trees behind the house. The sunset in the west and from late spring and across summer mostly happened behind the tall trees, and now they were gone, the garden enjoyed a couple more hours of direct sunshine each day. The garden was a testament to that, with its burgeoning and blooming buds, flowers, and vegetables. The potatoes might be late this year, but I'd saved quite a few of the other root vegetables while they were little more than seedlings. I'd lost many when the original garden was destroyed, but with what was left I could space those so they wouldn't need thinning out later. Miraculously, it was still going to be a beautiful garden in a practical sense that balanced efficiency and beauty at the same time. Not the most formally beautiful, yet it possessed that structured randomness of a pleasant cottage garden in development. And with so much more to come. However, that picnic table was still there, solid and robust, and it remained a hideous testimonial to a horrific event, and to what had been here before. The willows were just easy to plant, quite simply because they were so eager to get on with their lives, dig a hole, stick in a sapling and tramp around to firm it in. I also chose to have lines of angled saplings crossing each other so they could be weaved into a sheltering hedge as they grew. When I ran out of saplings at the edge of the area I wished to shelter, I just cut a branch off the more robust saplings and stuck that in the ground. They would all grow with such enthusiasm. The willow's an amazingly useful plant if you have room for it. That there were so many plants to plant benefited my fitness and getting an important task done and out of the way. Truthfully, it was to avoid settling down too early in the evening. Wine had suddenly become a companion in crisis again. It seemed that only a single slip was enough to tip a melancholic person like me off any wagon. Despite my attempts to brush it to the back of my conscious mind, the unconscious kept digging away. It kept reminding me indirectly that there was nothing normal about what I was experiencing and, just like the traveler's advice, it might be a good idea to bugger off out of there. I couldn't bugger off, so I sought less physically damaging means than alcohol for dealing with unconscious stress. Yet, compared to some people I'd known, I wasn't a serious drinker. But that was no excuse. There are 2 old abandoned railway tracks that lead off and across Anglesey from the main Holyhead-Bangor London line. One cuts through the centre and up to the northeast tip of the island. It only passes through 2 rural villages, one of them quite serious sheep-throwing territory. The other line is again off the Holyhead line, but this one cuts across mostly open countryside to access the east coast beach villages like Benflick and Pentrath. There's one particular spot on the second line I used to enjoy visiting because of its comfortable solitude and echoing evening birdsong. I'd always felt safe there in what I considered a curiously calming and healing setting. For me, it was part of an acceptable otherness. I'm pleased to report that it wasn't a place much frequented by humans, and will leave its description vague for that reason. I usually parked at the top of a very steep hill and allowed gravity to draw me downwards at a speed acceptable to my world-weary knees. The road is single track, and part of the length had been recently tarmacked, with the black stuff folding over the edges onto grasses crushed by heavy tractors. One evening, sequential to what had been going on, I just felt the need to be there, so I might find a desperately sanctuary in that calm I'd once enjoyed there. Except for nature's voice expressing a complexity of soul-nurturing messages across the deep valley, it was fresh and tranquil. The buttercups and campions raised themselves and my spirits over broad earth walls, now replacing the smoky clouds of bluebells and soft butter yellows of pretty primroses. Everything cascaded down the road. The trees on the left cast their new green umbrella over me, as I tumbled down to the small humpback bridge in the bottom where the road rises once again. I had warm memories of the bridge with my mother. In the early stages of her illness, and as she was declining, she still lived at home more or less independently. So I took her out in my car most evenings and weekends across the ancient and forgotten roads of the island. It was a place of bitter-sweet emotions that were finally losing the sharp pangs and releasing warmer memories to be first in the queue of reflections. The bridge was a place my mother loved passing through slowly. And so I was talking to both her and my father as I walked down to the small perfectly formed old railway bridge. I was once spotted talking to them by a passing farmer, and when he stopped his tractor and asked if I was talking to the fairies, I replied it was with my parents. He nodded compassionately and understood. We were both of that age. He admitted that it was something he did quite often when trying to remember how to solve some problem on the farm. His father had always known what to do, and quite often, the solution could be found among memories of conversations. But like me, he admitted that he should have listened more intently and more often. He was doing his best to share the family farming lore with his sons, both of whom seemed more interested in anything but farming. Farming was too much hard work, but he hoped that the monotony of working in a factory for a few years would make them appreciate the freedom that farming brought. Times were always tough in farming, he told me. Yeah, I thought. You voted for Brexit for more money and fewer welfare regulations and ended up with less of the former and more of the latter. Success in diplomacy depends on what you don't say. So I said nothing, and admired the massive tractor of a poor farmer. Moving on. Lord Beauchamp had overseen the closure of so many rural railway lines in the 1960s, and left many small communities across Britain isolated. Many of those communities eventually died or became enclaves and bastions for the middle class. In that way, the island was no different from any beautiful rural area anywhere else in Britain. I imagined that this must have been one of Beauchamp's easiest decisions. If he'd even known about it. The small steam railway was once full of happy summer visitors being carried to and from the East Coast beaches, but during winter, it must have been a very lonely journey to the main line and Bangor or to the Wheatley market in the county town. Exactly why someone had built that particular railway, I don't know. But it's usually all about profit. It's always been a mystery to me. Maybe the Victorians built it because they were so much in love with engineering and couldn't stop building things. They built simply because they could build. Slightly more than a few hundred yards on the left-hand side and away from the bridge, the land broadens out, becoming lush pasture as the valley created by a geological fault falls away. Looking to the east down the railway in the direction of Pentrart, it almost immediately entered a narrow and deep man-made gully. It was dark and mostly overgrown down there, full of weed tree saplings and brambles that looked eviler than those in Mr. Warburton's garden. I could imagine them calling to me like sirens, demanding revenge for what the mycelium told them I'd done to their cousins in Traja Bay. It was a sight best viewed from the bridge, but also very much in keeping with the broad feeling I had about the place, shelter for all manner of small cuddly end of the food chain animals. I kept thinking as I looked to the east. How much would it cost to create those symmetrical smooth vertical sides to the rail track with all of today's engineering knowledge and equipment? And there was always some rumor appearing in the Daily Death about the old railways being cleared and a walking and or cycle path being created. Me? I reckon it'd be a heartbreaker and a complete waste of public money, which I reckon must have been the motto of a few politically biased local quangos. As I said, I walked down toward the bridge after parking and locking the car at the top of the hill. Why I even bothered to lock it baffled me. I'd love for it to be stolen and totaled. It was a constant embarrassment that the universe insisted I bear, in case I should ever become a narcissist. The universe should be worrying about bigger things than my ego. The walk down the hill was always a form of ambulatory meditation for me, as I sent out my sight and hearing across the pleasant little valley. More so at twilight. I would occasionally stop and listen to the echoing songs of blackbirds and robins calling out to attract a partner. The closer you were to sunset, nature became so noisy that it was difficult to pursue their conversations across the fields. So I used to wait a while, until more of the birds settled down and it was possible to follow individual voices. A bit like following Brian Wilson's unique and complicated harmonies through Beach Boys songs. Anything that draws your attention outside of yourself must be good for your heart and soul, I reckon. It has to be. And the reasons why I like this place? Well, they varied each time I came here. I ambled down the road and around the long right-hand curve that finally brought me to the little humpback bridge. The bridge is steep and probably in better condition than structures less than a quarter its age, and if I were a normal person, I should have been clicking away with my phone or camera way back. But I think we've long established that I'm certainly not normal. Anyway, I'd no one with whom to share my photographs. And even if I did, I would always have preferred to bring her here, because it was nicer and more romantic. I think it is. I imagine so. Is it? I've lost touch. Then I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. There was an unexpected conversation going on right on the brow of the bridge. And from the calmness of their discussion, I had the distinct impression they'd been chatting for a while. A magpie, a hare, and a pheasant hen. All of them. They're on the brow of the bridge. In a triangular conversation. Now, how odd was that? I already knew that I was subservient to a cat, so I was unsure where I stood in the hierarchy relative to these three characters. It was a question answered quite quickly. I used to be unsure whether it was all humans or just me, who were regarded with general contempt by other species. However, by then I knew it was just me. The pheasant facing me stared at the magpie on his right. The hare on his left turned around so that all three were being less than subtle in staring coldly at me. Their conversation halted briefly. They scanned me up and down in a cursory manner, regarded each other in some unspoken discussion, stared down at the worn grey tarmac road, and then re-engaged in their conversation, dismissing me from conscious thought. We move through a world where nothing is strange because we don't want it to be. Because we're scared of anything that makes us feel insecure, and uncertain of our belief in our mastery of all things. But strangeness is all about us, if we only stop to linger, look and listen. Having been put in my place good and proper, I leaned against a vaguely sound old 5-bar wooden gate to watch them. It looked strong enough, so I climbed to sit on the top bar. It gave a few inches before taking my weight, and I rested there for 5 minutes, watching them converse intensely, looking from the one to the other as they spoke. No lips moved, no mouths or beaks distracted from their silent conversation. By then, I was too far down Shadow's trail to be surprised by any of it. I just sat and watched patiently. Intrigued. Well, as intrigued as I can be these days. As far as I know, animals of different species only collaborate when there's a definite mutual benefit to be gained. 2 items here. 1. Why were they having a chat here of all places? 2. What was the advantage that could be gained from the unlikely engagement between a hare, a magpie and a pheasant? Of course there was a precedent to all of this, the cat. I tried to find a distinct line through recent to now. The magpie is a pretty intelligent tool using cheeky bird, but I wouldn't necessarily call it aggressive. The pheasant is as timid as you like, and the hare. I couldn't understand why a hare would be there in the first place. 2 sets of feathers and a single fur. Everything about it was unlikely. But so was a time-traveling and self-multiplying cat who could close holes in reality and fight ghosts fearlessly. They finished their conversation, and were on the brink of parting when I decided to call out to them. Any of you guys know a weird black cat? The 3 stopped and scrutinized the stupid human for a few intense seconds before slipping away. The pheasant dropped back over the side of the hump and out of sight, followed by the hare. The magpie hopped to the side of the road, waddled between the grey posts of a wooden fence of the same quality material as my gate. He disappeared noiselessly among the grasses and loose hedgerow. I just knew that their meeting must have been a regular event, because all other animal, bird and insect life had carried on all around us, just like a hungry queue in a chip shop might become bored with a punch-up outside. I allowed them a few minutes to make a dignified exit from a scene of their own manufacture, then dropped carefully off the rickety gate and ambled gently onto the bridge. I reached where they'd been standing, or sitting in the hare's case, and despite some vague anticipation, there was nothing to suggest that such a meeting had occurred. Neither feather nor fluff. Had I arrived 10 minutes later, I'd have known nothing about that curious conflab. I looked over both sides of the bridge onto the rails below, and the untidy gully sides, and saw nothing of our conversationalists. Not that I'd expected to see any of them. If an animal or bird wants to melt into a background, then it will do so as an act of will. And it would be easy to do so down at the level of the rails. I'd been down to the tracks once. Just for a look. And I'd made a half-hearted attempt to navigate to the man-made gully. It was another lesson in how thick and treacherous brambles can be. It was simply too dark down there for any plant to thrive, and everything lay wan and pathetic on the track's rocky foundations. This was the perfect environment to challenge determined sycamore saplings and brambles. That was it really. It was a damp, cold and dark place where nothing pretty wanted to grow. I could see plenty of brambles down there. The vicious bastard version. I'd been amazed at just how long the bastard things could stretch along the ground, just waiting to trip and maim you for life. Mr. Warburton's garden definitely had nothing on this lot. This was the vicious free-range stuff. Nothing woke, bland or liberal about this ruddy thug. I looked down along the 2 rails, side by side standard gauge and dull red rusted, which disappeared quickly into the gloom. If I was gloom, I spoke to the universe. If I was gloom, then this is where I'd really want to be. It's a rest home or holiday resort for the glooms. The universe chose not to reply. Magical Dingley Dell was up top, and not down there. I was distracted from my profound thoughts by a heavy pulsing rumbling and rattling. I knew a sizable heavy tractor would soon be coming down the hill. If I were lucky, it would be a proper farmer, and not a 17-year-old twat with his foot flat down on the accelerator pedal, and his mobile phone glued to his ear. Thankfully, it was the farmer again. I stepped off the bridge toward the gate as he came around the corner and into view. There was no way that a tractor and this human could be on the bridge at the same time. He was driving one of those giant tractors farmers bought and immediately covered in mud and cow shit, in case people start inquiring about how little money there was in farming. Why on earth did they need these gigantic beasts on the island? I could only think of a few large estates that grew major crops, while the remainder just seemed to move animals about from the mountains to the island and back. Maybe the size of their tractors was a manly expression of how good their accountants were, or something like that. I was meeting a person and not a stereotype, I told myself. And this gentleman was pleasant enough, chapel decent. He pulled all his hundreds of horses to a standstill beside me and my gate and switched off the engine. Same as last time, man of late 50s, fair hair fading to grey sticking out under his tweedish flat cap. He wore a proper heavy lumberjack shirt beneath a dirty wax jacket, and dark green waterproofs over trousers. His old grey Wellingtons had clearly seen more than enough cow shit in their time. He pushed open his door, and I could feel the heat from within touch me briefly, before wandering away to destroy the atmosphere. I couldn't cast any judgment because I would myself soon be burning wood illegally, according to the lovely TPO. Farming can be such a lonely job, and as a kid, I remember island farmers always stopping and having a chat with someone. They had Fergies, smaller tractors in those days. He was as pleasant as before, his face large and robust, wind-blown red cheeks from grimacing into the weather. He'd clearly abandoned self-regard to the most horrible winter weather, while most of us were cowering indoors. "You again?" He smiled and spoke in a strong Anglesey farmer accent. "Me again," I smiled back. "Thought it was you." He gesticulated over his right shoulder with his thumb. "I wouldn't park your car up there, you know." The sweet and sour fragrance of manure tumbled warmly out of the cabin. "I was hoping someone would steal it," I proposed. "You've got a better chance of that further inland." He smiled and winked at me. "They'll even bury it for you with a council JCB, apparently." The farmer glanced across to the sunny open land. "You really like this stretch of road, don't you?" "Like I told you last time, I used to have a job that followed me everywhere, and then I found this place. It's a bit like being in the Foreign Legion. So easy to forget what ails you." He shrugged an uncertain response. The man had probably always been too busy to have indulged in such impractical thoughts. "Not everyone's as comfortable being here as you are." He went on to report that this was one of those occasional spots in local legend, where shadows begin to move in between the two lights. Even my father, tough as he was, would always put his foot down if he had to come this way at night on his little Fergie. Ghosts. Here we go again, I thought. Is there anywhere on this damn island that hasn't got ghosts or bloody aliens on it? The old man just said he found it unsettling, that's all. And added thoughtfully, for him, it was a feeling more than anything he could put his finger on. "Dodgy ley line or something," I said flippantly. He shrugged again. "I'll be honest with you," he said, as he turned and put his foot on the clutch, set the tractor in gear, and then brought his hand to the ignition button without starting up. "It may be that I learned to be wary of the old man's ways, but it's the kind of place where even I put my foot down now. So if I hear the sound of an approaching tractor on a moonless night, I'd better get off the bridge because you won't be stopping for anyone." "That's right," he answered brightly and pressed the ignition, and the engine roared into life. He shouted down over the noise. "I'll see you about." Pulling the door to him. He gave me the single index finger salute and was off, away over the bridge and up the hill in no time at all. I knew what he meant by places being unsettling, but I found the bridge in this valley reassuring, because I visited at a specific time of day. All of us, including the world, are passing through time, light, and darkness. Everything we look at is colored by those three conditions. I was thinking this as I took one final look over the bridge toward the gully, and the darkening expanse of unpassable brambles and saplings. There were a fair number of these gullies or man-made ravines along the 3 railways across the island. I've looked at a few on maps and wondered how many were actually needed, whether they couldn't have saved money by simply swinging the rails around that specific piece of rock. I was pulling away when a bizarre shifting occurred at the far end of my vision. A large shadow moved quickly across an obscured view in that dark distance, and then disappeared. It had moved from right to left in what I guessed was the center of the gully, which was of course impossible, if not just plain stupid. Nevertheless, the rapid shift of shadow had been large enough to be a cow. A bloody big cow at that. But how the hell would a cow have got down there in the first place, and what the hell would have drawn it there? Cows are as inquisitive as they are stupid, but not even they are that stupid. I leaned far over the wall, not that it helped me see any better, and focused on where I thought I'd seen the rapid shifting movement. There was nothing to see. I shut my eyes and tried to visualize the topography of this part of the island. The gully cut through an outcrop at the bottom of a steep valley that descended from both sides for about a mile or so. The land undulated hereabouts, and the railway moved mostly through shallow man-made gullies and ravines to maintain its level. Any sensible farmer aware of their cow's predisposition to wander would have kept fencing in good order. The responsibility actually lay with the railway company who still owned the line, but farmers would have jury-rigged their own fencing here and there. It was cheaper to do that than spend months, if not years, trying to chase compensation for injured animals. Sheep are even worse wanderers. However, they don't make sheep that big. Not even here. I was surprised and puzzled. It felt, on limited reflection at least, that I'd probably amplified shadows that were already amplifying themselves as day gave way to night, and I concluded that whatever I'd seen might have been odd to my experience, but it certainly wasn't a wibbly-wobbly cat-related event. I felt tired. That was enough intrigue for one day. I wondered whether Shadow had come back, or if he was still off on one of his probably violent excursions again. By the time I'd ambled back up the hill to my car, the matter of the mysterious large cow had passed into irrelevance when placed against the mystery of the pheasant, the magpie, and the hare. And supper. I was very hungry. My hero was back, but he wasn't really interested in supper. "Already killed and eaten something interesting, have you?" I asked, as he sniffed at the bowl of cod, and some other offensive-smelling ingredients. Shadow was fickle, and as most cat owners know, fickle is generally at the more sensible end of the complex spectrum of cat behavior. I checked the garden before it got too dark. For one thing, to make sure it was all there, which is more than I could say about myself. I then settled down with an appalling meal of beef flavor noodles and fish fingers. It was gross, carbohydrate overload that left me feeling full, horribly full and unsatisfied. It was rubbish, and if my mum could have seen me she'd have told me off. It would have been better had I'd followed Shadow's lead, and not eaten. I poured myself a tumblerful of 13.5-degree cabbie while I was aping the sophisticated process of cooking. An ape could have done a better job. Other than a small sip to signal the transition from dusk into night, I hadn't touched it again. I was back sort of feeling my way around my needs and accommodating them as lightly as I could. The cottage felt as if it needed a damn good fire, so I built a damn good fire. I used old seasoned logs rather than the new stuff, because I am at heart an environmentalist when I can afford it. Winter could well see me using the recent logs to keep warm. Needs must. There it was again. Was it just because of the loss of my woodland? I looked at Shadow, knowing I was being watched. I just said nothing, and let it slide. I sat at one end of the sofa, stockinged feet up on my little table, and the glass of wine in hand listening to the crackling of the fire. At least I felt warm. Why couldn't more of my life be like that? So far, I've described an average person's evening relaxing with my eyes closed, ears attuned to the fire, and in a calm state prior to looking for an interesting BBC radio play upon which to drift away. I felt warm, I felt safe, and I felt comfortable holding the wine in my mouth to taste it rather than slugging it back disrespectfully. The wine? Some relationships are just up and down and complicated. And you just have to leave it there. I opened my eyes and looked across at Shadow at the other end of the sofa perfecting his sleeping technique. "You okay?" I asked. His left ear flickered in acknowledgement that the human had said something. His eyes remained closed, probably hoping I'd shut up or just go away. "Right," I said. "You'd let me know if you weren't." I held up the glass of wine to the billowing flames. The wind was picking up outside, though not enough to need tying anything down. I then checked both sides of the fireplace and decided that there was enough wood there to turn this composite living space cum kitchen into a sauna. "Shall we build a sauna?" I suggested distractedly, while being caught up in the ruby-red clarity of a decent wine in a clean glass. The ears didn't flicker that time. "I like our little chats," I said, and was amused that his ears flickered. Shadow was a cat who appreciated sarcasm, and was able to throw it straight back at you with extreme power in a most profound wounding silence. "Here's a little story or a joke for you," I said, and took a sip of mellow fruitiness with a flat bitter tannin tang at the end. "Once upon a time there was a pheasant, a magpie, and a hare, who met regularly on a bridge. At least I think they do. In the middle of nowhere." That struck home. Shadow raised his head and stared at me in furrowed brow mode, which by now I knew revealed a keen interest. He then pushed himself up to standing on all fours, and indulged in a gloriously long stretch before settling down à la Chat Noir to watch me closely. I wondered why. He cocked his head to one side, and so I told him what I'd seen, where I'd seen it, and what the farmer had told me. I left out the bit about the shadow cow because it didn't seem important. He seemed to ponder on my little story, and I felt proud that the cat was taking me seriously. How far I'd traveled in my recent life. After a few moments he stared past me into the fire, and I could see the flames dancing in his eyes. Then, they suddenly whipped back to me. He'd made a decision. He sat back down decisively in his corner, and cast a last enigmatic glance in my direction before settling. I knew he was intrigued because he hadn't closed his eyes as he lay there in semi-self-cuddle. For my part, I was quite pleased to have piqued unexpected interest. I still thought that a tri-species conversation was odd if not extraordinary, although I could see nothing in it to worry about. For a change. At 11 o'clock, Shadow performed his usual magical stunt of disappearing through the door. He stood in front of it, stared, I opened the door, and he stepped out confidently into the darkness. The nearby worlds probably quaked in fearful anticipation. But I knew nothing of that. He kept doing that. And it was beginning to irritate me, since I'd go to bed with him outside, and the following day, there he would be, sleeping soundly in his corner of the sofa. It was all a species-dedicated exercise in humiliating the nearest human, namely, me. My irritation passed swiftly and I thought no more of it. I placed my still near full glass on the table and hunted around BBC podcasts. I found a documentary about Jeff Bezos. And I must have drifted off to the sound of him guffawing. The last thing I remember from that documentary is that it's always day one at Amazon, and they have to push hard each day to make the company successful. Sound philosophy that. It happened to be how I gardened. It was midnight when I woke up, drowsy but fine and warmly pleased that I'd barely touched the wine. I went and greeted the murmuring fridge freezer and poured the wine into the ice cube tray to save it for future gravies. I only noticed Shadow stuffed in his little sofa corner when I went to check the door was locked. This human opening the door lock, there was absolutely no need for it, as was evident in the sleeping cat mysteriously back inside. After a quick rub down with an oily rag, I brushed my teeth and went to bed, quietly proud that the wine was becoming a gentle companion again, rather than a curse, although my temperance did depend on crises continuing to absent themselves from my life. It was reasonable human time of 0700 when I woke up feeling unwell. It wasn't the wine, and I sought to dezombinalize myself with a savage cup of coffee and stood vertically near comatose at the door. Checking my phone, I found that I'd received a text yesterday evening. That's the problem with any mobile phones down here. They seem to depend more on ley lines. The signal seemed to be tidal, drifting in and out of the cottage and its grounds, and I'd never received a text on time since moving in. That mild moan aside, it was a message from Jenny that had actually arrived after I'd nodded off during Jeff's story. She'd cancelled her trip down south, and her children and grandchildren would be coming to stay for the week. She asked whether I fancied joining her for lunch, and could I please bring a saw with me while I was at it. Why be subtle? Still, Jenny was an excellent cook and knew that I loved her food. A bit of well-rewarded hard work for a friend was always a good deal. A few hours later, I left Shadow to his own devices on the sofa and locked the door. While it might keep out any ruffians, it wouldn't keep the cat in. Before leaving, I advised him where the vacuum cleaner was kept and heard the entire universe laugh hysterically. We sat at the table that Jenny had set up in the middle of the back lawn that the landscaper had mown for her. She told me that for £2,500, they would dig it up, remove rhododendron roots, and prepare a new lawn for her, but it wouldn't be ready until summer had passed, and would require a fair bit of TLC, obviously at further cost. As a matter of principle, Jenny doesn't do TLC, and neither does she waste money. I agreed with her confidence that Mr. Warburton's garden of old would re-establish itself, lawn and all, if given enough encouragement and feed. The lawn was really scrappy and patchy in places, thanks to lack of light and hydration caused by the heavy rhododendrons. Where the contractor had allegedly kept his contractual promise and lifted all the roots, there were large patches of bare soil. Grass is a thug and should recover well in time. I told her I'd collect a bag of grass seed from the garden center and ask about lawn food. That would take care of those patches. It was a much-loved garden, I told her, and it's missed that. It knows it's going to feel loved again. It's not used to attention, Jenny. So therefore, be gentle and kind. No shouting. I held up a finger to emphasize the last point. You're expert all of a sudden, she said, and pointed at me with her fork. What was I talking about, the garden or myself? I held up my hands to stop her from flowing into her favorite topic when I was about. Seeing as I'd successfully managed to cut down all the trees behind my cottage, then would I mind applying that putative skill and doing some tree work for her? I didn't have the heart to tell her that it had nothing to do with me. It had been achieved by 3 cats, one sleeping, and was the result of the demise of a complex of holes in the space-time continuum. It was easier to nod. Jenny was concerned there was a future problem that needed to be preempted. It lay at the back of the garden next to the outhouses where she was going to locate her new studio office. Jenny felt that the trees were eventually going to encroach and steal her light, and I saw what she meant. Jenny was right, there wouldn't be a problem of overhanging branches for a few years, but it would happen. Typical of her, she had already decided on the trees that needed their branches cut back and had let them know they were in for the chop. It had already been decided that I'd work first before receiving my reward of a nice lunch. It took little more than half an hour of delicate balancing on a ladder set against each tree, doing my best not to kill myself. I also received plenty of expert advice on how to do the job from someone who'd never picked up a saw or cut any branches during this particular lifetime of hers. Lunch earned, we both sat down to a Middle England light luncheon table of glorious delights. By the time I'd finished a large slice of the quiche Lorraine, I felt like proposing to Jenny. I decided to delay it until I could be sure that it would be a relationship of equals. Jenny frequently told me that she hated potato salad. I tell you one thing though, there can't be many people in this principality who can do better. I once used to be capable, but these days I'm useless cooking for two, either too much, too little, or too heavy. Yet, by some esoteric magic, Jenny can cook the perfect meal portions for two people of differing appetites. When I'd arrived at the bungalow, I'd stood at the top of the front steps looking in and closed my eyes. It felt obvious that this house had been ready for Jenny, and had embraced, matched, and returned her love and commitment. The furniture, implements and decorations she'd brought with her made the house feel lovely, bright, and warm. There was a new door out of the kitchen replacing the split one. I was also given the third degree as to whether I'd damaged that one myself. The only odd thing she'd encountered was the aftershave on the stairs. I'd told her the story about Mr. Warburton, and so she greeted the old gentleman every time she smelled the aftershave. Most important of all, evil Edgar and his son hadn't returned. Not that I expected them to after Mr. Warburton had terrified the bejazzas and some other matter out of Harry the bastard. The reason I was doing the work was because her children and their families were up at the end of the week. She'd already lined up some light work for them, painting and such. The tasks she didn't trust them with had been left to me. We wandered about the garden and identified a few more jobs that her kids could do, and those for which it might be best if I sacrificed my health and well-being. I did my best to leave the place as idiot-proof as possible with the correct jobs lined up for the family. Before leaving, I stood in the hallway and once again sent my senses out in all directions. "This is a very pleasantly happy house," I said. "Isn't it just?" My friend smiled. "I know that I'm very lucky." I left with a small box of Jenny's spicy vegetarian samosas, half a large pork pie, and a plastic container of her salad with a small jar of her magical dressing. I concluded again, not for the first time, that I must look like some incompetent idiot who has to receive detailed instruction on general salad management. It was worth it though. I gave her a big hug. I told her I loved her, that we should get married so that I could spend all her money and add to her family as soon as possible. I proposed that we should make it formal right then. Jenny advised me that it was an interesting idea, and maybe we should talk about it another time. With a warm long kiss on my cheek and suitably patronized, I left, with a pleasant glow and some samosas. I really should put up a bit more of a struggle. The day had passed into early evening when I got home still buzzing. Shadow was sat on top of the hideous picnic table in the center of my beautified desolation when I trotted down the lane. He wasn't even attending to the little sparrows having a dust bath a few feet away. It seemed now that birdies in the garden were as indifferent to him as he was of them. Little birds didn't interest Shadow, because he was a cat only interested in bringing down horrid monsters and evil empires. He cocked one eye at me, and I cocked one eye back at him, and we both stood there, cock-eyed. An order was being directed at me. The only recent event worthy of comment had been the small railway bridge. "Do you mind if I keep my supper first?" I asked. He neither agreed nor offered any contrary orders. The murmuring fridge allowed me to place the salad within. I don't like cold salad, but I didn't know just how much time Shadow was going to steal from my life this time. Spicy samosas are always tastier at room temperature as far as I was concerned, and like samosas, a salad is not a dish best served cold. I don't know if it was cat-related, but the grinding and juddering racket in the car was gone. I'd just sort of forgotten about it, and when I did remember, it was gone. Too many other things to worry about, so I left it on the back burner next to a saucepan, full of festering general hopes and fears. Already longing for my lovely salad supper, I led the way back up to my fragile little car, followed by Shadow. But unlike your average cat, he paid no attention to the rustling in the tall grasses and the bouncing birds busy on the track. Clearly, the message had got out about his indifference, even though I'd warned them that he couldn't be trusted. "Do you have contempt for all living things?" I asked, as he took his usual perusing position on the back shelf. Dear Lord. You could really sense his Machiavellian intelligence when he chose to respond with one of his looks. As we neared mysterious large cow territory, he carried on scouting all the way up to the hill above the humpback railway bridge. I watched his concentration with interest and began wondering whether we were both moving through the same environment. We set off down the road once the car was parked in the usual spot. And since I had a nice salad supper waiting for me, I decided to lock it. The earth wall on our right remained as inundated with fresh green and as gently beautiful as the previous evening. Looking out over the wall, you could see the hill slipping away steeply in the direction of the railway, and then stopping abruptly like a posh garden haha, when it dropped into the gully. I could see glimpses of the railway as it moved in and out of man-made gullies on a stretch of rail to the east. It was at its deepest at the bridge, still out of sight. That's where we were both heading. Shadow hopped on top of the wall for a good look and then jumped down, crossed the road and disappeared into the trees in the narrow woodland running down to the bottom. "You embarrassed to be seen with me or something?" I called after him. The silence indicated that it wasn't, or something. It was another quiet evening, and the sky had milked over since my lunch with Jenny. It didn't feel oppressive, because we were yet to be touched by summer warmth. As soon as the sun was on its way down, the temperature still dropped. It was an excellent example of a traditional old-fashioned Anglesey spring of warm days, cool evenings, and the occasional worry of a morning frost. I could see oak and sycamore in the near distance, and in the woodland next to me, the distinct signs of ash dieback were apparent at the leafless tips of branches. Ash was one of my favorite trees, and would soon be a thing of the past, at least for a generation until those genetically immune to the disease could grow. I felt sad that I would see the ash die in my lifetime, but not be alive to see its resurrection in the future. Bit of a bastard that. The alarm calls of blackbirds and rapid scurrying in the undergrowth confirmed that Shadow was making his way downhill in the trees parallel to me. Little did they know that he had no interest in them. All he was doing was helping them hone their instincts in a disinterested way. It seemed that his threshold of disinterest in birds and humans was more or less the same. He stepped back onto the road once we were off the straight line of the hill and it began to curve downwards to the bridge. Shadow walked down beside me in a manner that any casual observer might have regarded as cute. But obviously, ordinary humans didn't know that cute was completely absent from this particular cat's genes. The humpback bridge was empty of last night's varied focus group, and so I looked down at Shadow for a bit of guidance. I pointed to the spot where the two birds and the hare had been chatting, and left him to his investigations, while I leaned my bottom against the east wall and closed my eyes to listen to the sounds about me. Everything began gently fading away from us in all directions, until all that was left was the absence of something, and my tinnitus. It felt as if everything was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen now that Shadow was here. That breath was held for a moment, and then it felt as if whatever was imminent had passed. I opened my eyes when my arm was butted by Shadow's head. He jumped up on the wall beside me. I suspected he meant, shift it. And so, ever obedient to a bullying cat, I moved, and turned to look at him. "You want me to bugger off back to the car as well?" I asked sarcastically. A quick sideways glance told me I need not rush away. At least not yet. I was on the verge of making another sarcastic self-deprecating observation when I suddenly felt something. I felt a movement. I know that sounds odd. But I had felt a movement. Felt it. I don't know if that makes sense. In some way, it was a repetition of the shadowy cow incident of the previous evening. I leaned forward and stared keenly into the gathering creepiness of the gully. Shadow butted my arm with his head again. "In a moment," I said. All this pushing about and bullying was becoming rather tedious. I stared back down the track as I had the previous night and realized a simple truth that I'd missed then. While it might be spring up here on the bridge, down there, it was still winter. In fact, it was probably winter down there all the time. And a damp and cold one at that. I tried to give a form or a name to something I might have just seen but wasn't sure I had. "There's something down there," I said. And stood back straight. I turned to Shadow, who was staring equally hard into the shadows. He applied pressure against my arm and I stepped back once again. I stood in the center of the crown of this bridge, which was now losing the warm and private identity I'd always given it. I glanced over my shoulder at the other side that was a railway spilling out into open lush pasture land bathed in sunlight. Over there was nothing untoward or strange to attract my attention and make me worry. "This is way above my pay grade," I said. And I didn't for a moment think that the universe was listening. Hoping to make everything go away, I rubbed my eyes hard. And unfortunately, when I opened them again, everything was still where it had been 5 seconds earlier, except that Shadow was now parading slowly and deliberately backward and forwards on the bridge wall, as if he were trying to obtain a proper focus on something in the distant shadows. "I saw a cow over there last night," I said. That stopped him in his tracks. He regarded me with suspicion, as if I were lying to him. "It's the truth, I tell you. I saw a cow down there. A very big one," I added. "And don't ask me how the hell the daft thing got there, but that's what I saw. I think." There followed some serious cat contemplation and more marching backward and forwards. There was a great deal of staring at the bridge stones beneath his paws, then back to the railway track, followed by a further close evaluation of me, and the worthiness of my opinion on anything. I think it must have been Jenny who first came up with the idea of shifting dodgy ley lines that used to sweep through the office when the boss was in a full-on bastard mood. In the end, we found that there was only one solution to that. We left and took all the skills, good manners and luck we'd brought with us. That was one type of dodgy ley line and how to resolve its challenges. Here, for ley line, read instability. It was clear to me by now that Shadow brought his own particular brand of instability along with him. I looked at him again and reflected that maybe it was his role to simply stand still as a challenge to instabilities. Then he acted. We were currently in the pre-act waiting and thinking phase, before the cat dragged me into the heart of chaos. I closed my eyes again and enjoyed a small insight into big physics, and could see him as a gravitational anomaly swirling through time and space, interfering with temporal currents and objective space. Wherever he went, or was sent, you would see clear evidence of his passing, in the bodies of his enemies and debris of the conflicts. It must be like a slick of destruction through all that there is, with him at the center of its creation. I was now beginning to believe my own daft thoughts about this cat being a general in someone's army. All that profound thinking aside, I was still hoping that we'd get back home in time for me to enjoy Jenny's salad and samosas, hopefully at room temperature. I shook my head in futility of any expectation of agency, and found that a meeting was already in progress, and had stopped when I opened my eyes. All theirs were on me, the hare, the magpie and the pheasant. I know where I'm not wanted, I said, and wandered off to lean on my new favorite yet suspect 5-bar wooden gate. Central to the meeting was a cat who would ordinarily look at a hare and a magpie and pheasant as lunch and evening meal. Disappointingly, there was no tension on that open squared-off debating circle on the tired grey tarmac. Shadow was clearly the chairperson, and looked downright satanic as his gaze moved among his 3 focus group colleagues. I heard the tractor approaching down the hill behind us and looked toward Shadow, wondering whether it would be allowed to approach this unique scene. Of course it wasn't. There was a sudden but subtle change in the ambient light, and then everything fell silent. It seemed as if the noise of the tractor was fading away from us, and I knew that we'd moved. But not in space. Shadow had moved us in time, and we were temporarily out of sync with my world. The tractor would pass through, but we wouldn't see the farmer, either because it hadn't happened to him yet or wouldn't. Entanglement is useless unless you can use it. And Shadow, a small cat, had just done that and didn't look particularly bothered. It had to be that. Or at least something like it. The breeze I'd felt on my face earlier was still here, brushing across the leaves of the hedgerows during our alternate time on the bridge. It was real, but made no sense unless the wind had taken a 90-degree turn left into alternate time and then gone back out to meet itself at a different time. That would make 2 breezes, and that had to cause a minor distortion in the elsewhere and elsewhen. There had to be a price to pay for that. Like Jenny, the universe doesn't serve free lunches. I pushed myself away from the gate because I wanted to check on something I'd seen. Anything beyond 100 feet or so from the gully side was separated from us by a billowing lace curtain effect with a sickly amber hue to it. So maybe time had a color after all. And I was looking at it. None of it made any sense. Time, the forum, the shadowy cow, and the orange curtain. I couldn't see any reason for us to be here and not closer to Jenny's salad and samosas. It looked promising when the meeting broke up a short while later. The magpie flew to the top of the wall, and the hare and pheasant withdrew down to the other side of the bridge. I wasn't dismissed this time, just ignored altogether. I was wondering what the difference was, when the magpie hopped into the air and glided out as silent as a barn owl over the cow side of the bridge. I was speculating on what my role was going to be in whatever happened next. On the hare-pheasant side of the bridge was a little wooden stile above a set of concrete steps that would take an unsuspecting human down to the track, and its briars and brambles. "Why can't you do this yourself?" I asked. Shadow had walked to the stile and turned to face me, saying, as it were, "This way, human." I shook my head in frustration and despair and slunk after him. And I probably supplied some entertainment for the hare and pheasant with my sullen obedience to a cat. Bastards. I might even have you two for my supper one of these days, I wanted to tell them. I should have told the hare that he was one ugly specimen and would look great in a jug. "You two not coming with us then?" I inquired, and nodded my head in as sarcastic a manner as I could. "That figures." The magpie had settled on the overhanging branch of a weed tree, and could only be seen by the white on its wings by the time I made contact with clinker and track. If it had looked like a horrible mess to get through from up there, then down here, it seemed downright impossible. How the hell am I going to get through that? I asked. He seemed to be in direct communication with the magpie. Why can't you ask your feathered friend to go up there and have a look? At least that would spare me having to be flayed alive by this evil crap. I watched as Shadow moved along the ground and beneath the overhanging house of pain. What am I doing here again? Anyone? I saw the hare and pheasant staring down at me from the stile. And why can't the prospective Pate and her good-looking friend up there come with us? My role, whatever it was, must have been necessary because Shadow was being patient for a change. I made my way after him through a savage Sargasso sea of brambles that were always within millimeters of ripping the flesh off my back. Maybe the mycelium had told them what I'd done back in Mr. Warburton's garden. Compared to this, at its very worst, Mr. Warburton's garden had been like a bowling green. I kept tripping and just about managing not to fall. Had I fallen among this lot, then I wouldn't have been unhappy if someone had shot me to put me out of my misery. I cut my hand badly somehow without even noticing I'd done it. That meant that the bastard things, as they should now be known, were ridiculously sharp. Shadow was doing his best to set out a route I could follow, but being a cat he could easily make his way around or under all sharp obstacles. He seemed well suited for this kind of terrain, the correct scale of animal, an animal who knew what he was doing. And then there was me. Is this part of my training or something? I spoke with my normal voice and was silenced when he turned around sharply. He gave me an evil look that suggested not countenancing other silliness. I was bigger than him. He might have a substantial ego, but I was still bigger than him. I guessed that the distance we had to traverse was no more than about 70 or 80 feet, but it was ridiculously difficult. I ducked and I twisted every way possible, and for good measure I silently swore and groaned. It was impossible not to be injured, no matter how much care I took. The evening light above, when you dared take your eyes off the non-Disney side of nature, remained as it had on the bridge, with a caustic orange edging to everything. This time thing was determined to throw up variables. It was darker ahead, a strange darkness that had nothing to do with the peculiar light. It wasn't an absence of light, but rather shadows gathering together with a purpose to obscure what must be ahead. Please. No more holes in space. I could see Shadow's head bobbing up and down ahead of me as he gauged the distance to his objective. It was with a certain trepidation and curiosity that I continued to follow him. Mysterious no longer confused me. And curious had at least a bit of wit to it. Curious indeed. Here, on this savage nature-inundated length of abandoned railway track in the heart of the island, it really was strange to come across a large plain door of unknown manufacture on the left side cliff. Even in this eerie light, it just had to be a cheeky lipstick red. And, as if that wasn't enough, on the wall opposite was another door, directly in line. It was a dark brown or black door, and could even have been blue for all I could see. The rail disappeared at a wide earth track, about a dozen feet wide between both doors, and then continued onwards the other side. I looked across and down at Shadow and he returned the familiar dark look from under a perplexed brow. He was definitely confused. I checked the door on the right and the lipstick one on the left. I first thought they had something to do with nuclear fallout shelters used by the Royal Observer Corps to which my father once belonged. While waiting for the enemy to drop their load over the island, my father and his friends used to smoke, drink tea and play cards in their private underground bunker above an East Coast beach. Forewarned is forearmed as their motto went, which is more than I was right then. Shadow stared from one door to the other and then back at me as if I might be able to offer some guidance. We stayed hidden among the gathered shadows and were both taken aback when the red door suddenly opened outwards. It was curious that there was a light inside, but none fell out, which was intriguing but not a major culture shock. However, as an or so massive cow-like creatures tramped rapidly across the gap to the dark door, which had also opened up unexpectedly. The idiot side of my brain briefed me that this was certainly different. They quickly disappeared behind the dark door in a well-ordered fashion. I was shocked. But nowhere near as shocked as Shadow. He was so puzzled that he sat down on his backside and shook his head in disbelief. Of course they weren't cows. They were anything but. From what I'd just seen. They were giant beasts. Larger than cows, with vaguely humanoid heads and two spare arms with massive hands. There had been an intelligent intent to their disciplined movement, as I'd seen with Shadow in action. They also appeared to be wearing body armor and flak jackets and webbing along their flanks and backs. What? I said it aloud as the dark door closed silently behind them. It had all happened so quickly that I only managed to keep an impression of what I'd seen. What I had seen lay outside of any sensible reference in my imagination. Were they cows? I whispered the bloody obvious question to Shadow. Shadow wasn't listening because he was also busy wandering about in the land of the baffled and confused. He just sat there and stared at the ground. It was clear that whatever had just happened was unexpected, or made no sense to him. The magpie landed on a thin sapling branch above us that bent under its weight. I ignored it and spoke to Shadow. "Call me old-fashioned," I said, attempting to bring order to what was flying aimlessly around inside my head. But I always thought that cows only had 4 legs. I couldn't help but notice this lot had 6 if you count 2 arms as legs. And one of them had a Mohican hairstyle. What was that about? I remembered the wild hairstyle as a ridiculous after-memory. Shadow pondered my words for a moment, and then cast a glance up at the magpie, who had probably said something I couldn't pick up. I got the impression that they were having a serious chat, and I didn't need to guess the subject matter. My shock passed quickly and gave way to an adrenaline buzz. I wanted to have a look at those doors. I crept forward carefully and made it past Shadow into the clear space that was a well-used path between the doors. Although I still carried with me the wary companionship of sensible fear, I could stand up. On the other side of the gap, I saw the massive cloud of a blackberry bush. I bet that it hadn't grown a single berry its entire life since that smug fat chain-smoking entitled bastard Beecham had pointed at a map and destroyed a lovely line between communities. Hopefully the bastard was still smoking. The door was definitely a door, except it had no handle, and was engineered so perfectly that I couldn't see a gap between it and the rock. When I touched it, I felt nothing. If I pushed, I knew I was touching something, but it seemed determined to defy identification as a sensory object. I walked across to the other, and again, other than the color, which I think was dark blue. I seemed to be color blind with black and dark blue. It was identical, and the join between rock and door was impossible. Both doors looked as if they'd been painted onto the near vertical walls. Yet they'd both opened outwards as perfectly normal functioning doors do, outwards like Scandinavian doors. Surely there couldn't be a link between the macho-looking cows and Sweden? I felt a rumble beneath my feet, and scarpered as quickly and as carefully as I could into the terrifying camouflage of the brambles and shadows. I'm not sure I'll ever trust another shadow. It's what they might contain that made me nervous. I hid behind a thicket and leaned against the wall, somehow holding in a scream as I impaled my back on a blackthorn mutant with 3-inch spines. Just as the scream was beginning to develop, the red door burst open, and one of the cow-like beasts more or less fell out and stumbled onto its front knees before righting itself with its arms. The beast bellowed loudly, no warm lowing from this monster, expressing its anger as it pushed itself up onto its full complement and turned to face the way it had come or fallen. It was no cow. This was a giant muscular beast that must have been 7 or 8 foot at the shoulder, and when it roared again at the interior beyond the red door, it raised its head to what must have been 10 feet in height. It was a bull whose arms were tree trunks that would have made Schwarzenegger and Stallone cover up in embarrassment. The hybrid humanoid bullhead was attached to a massive muscular torso that rose from the bull's body. It had to be a minotaur, half humanoid and bull. Humanoid because its face was broad and flat and covered in fine fuzz. It was a melange of human and beast displaying extreme rage over something. The way it was stumbling about gave the distinct impression it had just been thrown out of a pub. My mouth fell open in disbelief when I looked at Shadow, now flat on his belly and watching keenly. I slunk down further, feeling the thorn snag my shirt, and I accepted that I'd sooner be in agony than be seen. With a massive roar, the beast rushed headlong at the red door, which slammed back into its frame before it could reach it. And I felt the vibration along the wall behind me as the beast beat massive fists against the door, all the time roaring furiously enough to scare organic matter out of me. I'd never before been in the presence of such visceral and undeniable physical power. I swear that I could smell it from where I was cowering right then. So I drew myself further down as it rotated over its back legs and scanned its environs, looking for someone or something to thump. It gave the distinct impression that we were looking at something or someone violently drunk, and not in complete control of its faculties. Unlike those similar beasts who'd passed through a few minutes earlier, this one was not wearing body armor, although it was fully clothed. Its arms, its torso, and all its legs encased in what I hoped was not leather, but something similar with a flat sheen to it. The clothing was drawn tight across its back, revealing astonishingly powerful knots of massive muscles. All species alive now are the result of 1,000, 10,000 accidents along their genetic evolution. There's no reason why someone or something born in a similar environment on another planet should be identical to that born on Earth. It was an impossibility. And why should all creatures who come to conquer or ignore us be humanoid? This one might be no more than a few accidents away from us in evolutionary terms. Also, who said we had to be the dominant species? I looked across at Shadow in a brief meditation on that point. The Minotaur seemed to recover a bit of decorum, and railed at itself with a loud high-pitched whining and curious truncated tongue clicks. It reached a hand down the other side of its body and came back with a device that was evidently one designed for hurling projectiles. It looked exactly like a bazooka cum sawn-off shotgun, with the same relative configuration. It was appropriately sized for the massive hand that held it, a hand I now noticed that only had 3 large articulate fingers and an opposable thumb. It extended its arm and aimed at the closed red door, holding the weapon there for a few seconds before deciding that it just wasn't worth the effort. Instead, it replaced the gun and reached into a pocket on our side. Suddenly, the dark door opened silently, revealing an ill-lit metallic corridor interior. The Minotaur staggered through and the door closed noiselessly behind it. I stood up slowly, negotiating the horrors of my most immediate 3-dimensional world, and shook my head in disbelief. I wasn't sure if I'd seen wonders or seen horrors. What I'd seen was something that made me realize that instead of being unique, we humans were only one of many genetic misfits out there. And, as I suggested about Shadow, we were nowhere near the top of the intellectual or physical food chain. No one'll ever believe this. I turned and addressed the only possessor of a decent brain around right then. Did that cow thing just get chucked out of a pub? I made the grave error of leaning back in reflection. I winced and tightened up, thereby pulling a noble bramble across my cheek until it stuck deep in the flesh by my nose. I swore passionately. Bastard things. Receiving no lead from Shadow, I stood there a moment puzzled by what had just happened. In the middle of all the strangeness, something else made no sense. A curious thought struck me. The light, I cried out to Shadow, who was back up on all fours and still deep in thought. He turned and looked up. I might only have had a grade 6 in my physics O level, but I knew that I could add this light to the growing list of weird shit recently viewed. The light didn't shine out of either door. It was dark enough down here to see the light come out, but it only came up to the door and no further. That made absolutely no sense whatsoever. Light is consistent in that it always does what it always does. The only thing that can bugger up light's standard properties, as viewed by this thick human, is gravity, which can bend it. I think. Think back and reach for some me-based reality, I thought. The idea of the doors was as silly as it was ridiculous, because I no longer believed they were 2 old nuclear bunkers down there. Then the platoon of minotaurs, a drunk, and then finally, the non-shining light. I stared into nothingness for a moment, and then engaged with the mysterious cat again. None of that was real. It wasn't normal for the earth, was it? Shadow just watched me do my thinking and probably expected me to fall over. Rather than do that, I buried my face in my hands and tried to make sense of this weird shit upon weird shit. The Minotaurs had stepped out of one door and in through the other without any fuss whatsoever. This was obviously one of their normals. What a strange universe. The light's not shining out because it's not here. Hang on. That can't be right. But it's what I saw. That light is shining elsewhere. We're here and then you've got 2 theirs, one on either side of us. I was silent for a moment and aware that a cat was watching his human very closely. I stared back at him. 3 worlds. 2 elsewheres joined by a 15-foot gap in this one. The look of surprise on Shadow's face was unmistakable. Equally clear was that he wasn't going to break his habit and respond. The one behind the red door is a time bubble or something. It's like where you met Washibark, isn't it? There's a pub in there, and the other door. I could go no further. I don't know. I haven't got a bloody clue. It was almost making sense. But I had no context for anything I'd seen to make sense of any of it. In other words, close, but no banana. It was just something else to add to dots that might one day be joined together into a straight line. Or, it might not even be a straight line if it moved between the places I'd just seen. The person I'd given a lift to T-Crow said there was a lot of weird shit happening on the island. And he was a traveler between somewhere else and another somewhere else. That was another weird one. I should be nuts because of what was happening, but I wasn't. I was probably missing a vital gene somewhere. This is why you're here, isn't it, Shadow? Shadow ignored me and left me to my mind tearing while he went to look at the 2 doors. I went to have another look myself, and saw that both doors were beginning to fade away. This was another thing I couldn't even begin to speculate on or understand. It was just one variable too many for me, and I was glad that Shadow was experiencing something similar. It was satisfying for once to see his head turn from one previous door location to the other. You didn't know about this. How many entrances, exits and pathways are there on this island, and how many others did Shadow not know about? He now seemed more concerned than perplexed. He took one final look at both empty spots on the gully walls before turning and making his way back under the ferocious jungle toward the bridge. I leaned against my 5-bar gate and tried to guess how many scratches I'd suffered, and just how bad they were. I removed my shirt and held it up to check on the blood. Not bad. Other than a bleeding hand, there was only a single large isolated patch on my back I could attribute to thorns. My back must look pretty awful between these injuries and Mr. Warburton's garden. It was the one on the face I was most concerned about and would be impatient to inspect when I got back to the car. In the meantime, as I was carrying out my injury and trauma inventory, Shadow and his gang of hare pheasant and magpie were at it again. And there was a tangible tension in their postures this time. After a half hour, they broke their silence and went their usual ways off the bridge. Shadow popped up on the wall again and gave the rail track a final inspection. "What about the thing you did to close off the bridge for the tractor?" Immediately, the light changed from eerie orange to a clean pre-twilight, and a tractor thundered past, no more than a terrifying foot away from me. Bastard, bastard, bastard. Had I not been scared of him, I'd have thrown the cat off the bridge.